The Tokachi Millennium Forest in Hokkaido in Japan has been described by some as the best garden in the world, and its designer, Dan Pearson, one of the best garden designers in the world. Well, a couple of months ago, I was lucky enough to be in Hokkaido to see the garden, and today I'm in Dan's garden to meet him and to hear all about his Japanese adventure and the story of this incredible garden.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for visiting our garden. I am Miyamura, and I will be your guide for the first part. Now we are restoring the original flora.
The Tokachi Millennium Forest is the brainchild of visionary newspaper proprietor Mitsushige Hayashi. 30 years ago, he decided to make his business carbon neutral and bought the first part of this land, the forest, adding to it gradually to create a 400-hectare park. Hokkaido is the island in the far north of Japan. It was only colonised by mainland Japanese in the 1870s. The Aboriginal Ainu tribes had farmed this land sensitively for centuries. The settlers quickly cleared the forest for virgin timber, and the land deteriorated. Hayashi-san hired a team of Japanese experts to can a landscape to restore it. Dan says they faced some unusual challenges.
It wasn't a safe place. Everybody had to realise that you were a lot closer to a scary nature, and when Midori's gardening in the spring, for instance, they wear bear bells in the forest because when the bears wake up they're hungry and angry, and they want often plants that Midori's working close to as purgative foods to get their guts working, so they can be very fierce and dangerous at that time of year.
Even without the bears, the garden was too overwhelming for many visitors.
They'd opened the park and it was too big and too raw and too wild, and there was a restaurant and a walk through the woods and a view of the mountains, and people then felt like they couldn't go any further.
About this time, the Takana team met Dan. They engaged him to help, but not before putting him through an unusual vetting process.
Over the course of 3 days, I met his team. We made soba noodles together, cooked together, and every day the group got smaller until we were just left with Takano and his business partner and me. And we'd been walking in the forest, we'd been skiing, we'd gone up in a hot air balloon to see the landscape from the sky. And on the last day, Takano's wife gave us this little bag, and we drove out into the dusk. We got out halfway up the mountain and it was freezing cold and now dark. And eventually we dipped down into a little gorge, and in the gorge was a handmade onsen, which Takano and his team had made. And the three of us stripped off in this freezing -25. We got in, and in the bag there was a tiny towel and a can of Sapporo beer, which by then was super chilled. So we had the Sapporo beer, and as the moon came around the mountain, we were up to here in our necks in this hot water from the mountainside. Takano said, "So would you like to work with us on this project?"
That's the initiation test.
Yes, and with our knees touching, in the hot water, and it was an amazing moment, really, because I think it spoke so much about the art of hospitality and the importance of integrating yourself properly into that culture. I found that there was this wonderful cultural practice called Satyama. It was about communities only taking as much as they needed to from the land and the landscape. You inhabit the land more intensively close to where you live. So it might be that you have your close vegetable growing immediately around your houses and the things you might need on a day-to-day basis. And then the next layer, of course, might be your rice paddies immediately around. The next layer might be the foraging on the edge of the woods. The next layer might be a rotational system using materials from the woods for building. Finally, you go into the forest where you don't touch anything and there's a temple that reveres nature.
Dan started thinking how he might apply this principle. The first, more intensively cultivated ripple of the Satyama was around the cluster of buildings where there was a farm producing goat's cheese and a small cafe.
And then around that we made what we called the meadow garden, And the management in the woods was altogether more like a third ripple, where Midori, the head gardener there, would be managing the woods very lightly to clear the bamboo to keep the bears at bay, because the bears would nestle in the bamboo. And if you cleared the bamboo far enough back, you then opened up the forest floor where the bamboo had taken over because of the first fellings that happened with the settlers who came in and removed the big trees from the forest for lumber, so that the balance in the forest was disturbed and the bamboo took over, and the bamboo then had erased a whole load of the forest floor plants. So by taking the bamboo back for the safety, to keep the bears back, that then allowed the forest floor to regenerate with all the residual seeds that were still in the seed bank in the soil. So we then got all these very wonderful new floras happening, old floras being re-established. So you get out of your car, and the car is placed in a woodland with trees, which is your deep dive into a forested place, which sets the scene. But you're on a series of paths which are very clearly defined. So there are these zigzag paths, wooden walkways which float over the forest floor so you don't have to touch it. There are small paths which kind of roll through the landscape that move alongside in a different way. And they lead not very far through this deep, dark forest, but on a managed path to the restaurant. So you've gone through something which is... You're holding people's hands, exactly. The Ainu people who lived there before it was settled, they were an Inuit community and they were hunter-gatherers, so they moved up and down the rivers and they fished and they used the forest. So this environment was very much their environment. And we wanted that to be the first thing that you felt when you arrived, rather than a garden.
So I want to talk about your meadow garden, because that was astonishing to me. Bold planting, big scale waves of plants, and that was just gorgeous.
I wanted the garden to feel completely immersive. So if you imagine you've come through this shadowy woodland where in the summer it's almost deafening with cicadas, or in the spring it's alive with Caltha palustris and Candelabra primulus. It's a completely magical landscape, the woodland. And then you come out into what feels like this really big clearing on the edge of the woodland where we've made the meadow garden, which is high horticulture in a way. It's the absolute opposite from what you've just been through, which is a managed woodland. We didn't want it to feel like high horticulture, we wanted it to feel like it was part of the woodland, but we wanted to pump up the volume so it wasn't just a meadow. It was almost like a big canvas that the volume dipped and dived and became louder and quieter over the course of the summer. Maybe one or two species that might move through the whole garden. And then in the summer, we had these large swathes of a grass which was very mobile called Calamagrostis carfursta. So there were these big bands of grasses. What they allowed us to do was to make a big scale connection to the mountains, where you could see the woods going up to meadow on the mountains. And you could imagine that meadow was the same as the meadow that you were actually in. But as you move through the banks of grasses, you come into these different colour fields that would then change the mood of how you felt as you moved through these bands.
And you're on boards as well still on that time, but they get narrow and they get broad out. You're playing with people's emotions, aren't you?
Boardwalks that felt like riverbeds. So they were sort of wide and narrow and braided, like a riverbed might be braided. None of this would be possible if it hadn't been for Midori Shintani and her assistant head gardener Shintaro. They were absolutely committed to this vision coming to life. The land had been cleared, trees had been felled, so we were left with this big paddock in front of the restaurant building, which was put on the edge of the woodland, in which people didn't want to go. There was this huge space between the comfort of the restaurant and then the mountains beyond. We wanted to get them out there. So I thought about borrowing the view and literally bringing it into the foreground. So I did a series of drawings of the mountain profiles and then reimagined a series of foothills which then sat in this foreground with these, I think it's like 5 layers of small hills that work against each other with gentle slopes that lead away to your main vista of the mountains, and then these sheer drops into the next rise of the slope. So it's like a series of waves. They caught the light very beautifully. In the winter we didn't know it was going to do this. They whipped the snow so the snow would move through and form these amazing meringue shapes. And we also didn't know that they'd really play with the acoustics, so the concave and the convex harvested the sound very differently from the mountains or from the streams to either side. So there was this whole sensory thing that happened when you walked into this landform that was greater than the sum of all its parts, that was an unexpected thing that happened when you work at that scale. Sometimes you need to make these really big moves for something to feel inhabited at the right scale and not apologetic. The whole idea of this place is that you're drawn into a wilder landscape, a bigger landscape, that you then see as being something that might be touched less by man, but something that needs to be protected by man for its long-term future. Beginning of the project, a number of artists, including Yoko Ono, were asked to the site to make installations. So the park also became somewhere where art was used as a means of creating destinations and focal points. They would find a place that they felt had a resonance, and the work would then become part of the place because they'd felt something acute about that particular place.
When he created those mounds outside the dining area, Dan was trying to encourage people to go through the field and beyond to this path here, this winding, climbing path that takes you to a high viewing point so you can see the whole thing. There are easier ways of getting up here, but I think that's cheating. Coming down from Millennium Hill, we reach our final destination, the Forest Garden.
So this is Scabiaza ocraluca, which is cedar all through this central section.
You bought this place after you'd done this project. Did it influence your decision?
I've always been connected to landscape. I was brought up in Hampshire on the edge of the downs, and we had a big overgrown wild garden. Outdoor was my playground. I went to live in London for several years through friends and being younger, and it was fun, but my roots were always in landscape. And whenever I went to a new country, rather than go to look at a garden for inspiration, I'd go and look at landscape first, and then maybe find the garden second. This place was always on the back boiler as an idea, but for several years between being the ages of 24 to being in my early 30s, I was in charge of a garden that I'd designed for an old client of mine who's now become a very good friend, called Home Farm, and that was 4 acres of landscape garden in Northamptonshire. And the principle of the garden was that it was a garden without boundaries, so it was deliberately designed to key into the farmland around it and to be gardening with the environment that was there, with the conditions that were there, and not fighting it. So in a way, I was already doing what I then found in Japan, in Satyama, just instinctively. And when that place was sold in 2000, it then became an absolute prerogative to find somewhere that would allow us to do that for ourselves. I think when you're designing landscapes and gardens for other people, it's a vicarious exercise, and you have to put a certain amount of your heart into the process. But the difficulty with it, of course, is it's not yours and you can't inhabit that place. And I think that to really understand what you're doing in landscape, because it's constantly changing, you really need to be part of it. And because my work is plant-based, I need to be growing and using plants on a day-to-day basis. So when this place came up in 2010, it was instinctively the right place to make our own.
And has anything from Japan rubbed off on you here, do you think, or in the way you approach all gardening projects now?
Sense of place has always underpinned my work completely, and I think the time I've spent in Japan has helped to hone that appreciation of sense of place, because things are so much more nuanced there. You know, you can go much more deeply into understanding why something is a certain way. They have 72 seasons, for instance, not 4, so that every 5 days the season changes in a minute way, but once you're part of it, a significant way. And once you start to think about things like that, everything becomes more nuanced. So I think the nuance of the way that people look at things in Japan helped me to endorse what I was already doing very naturally and allowed me to go deeper. The whole idea of less being more, the whole concept of wabi-sabi, i.e. the beauty and imperfection. Gardens are never perfect places, you know, and the imperfection is often the thing that's most interesting.
Mr. Hayashi, I've seen no pictures of him. He's a newspaper proprietor, and I can find nothing about him.
Mr. Hayashi is a man who wears 7-league boots. He thinks differently to other people. He just thinks bigger. He's not afraid of scale. But there's a humility about him, which I think is a very different thing to the same businessman in the West. And I remember once when we went into the forest together, I saw him embracing a tree. So there's an esoteric side to him, which underpinned the businessman, which was quite an unusual combination of things.
How will it look, do you think, in 100 years?
Who knows? You know, things are changing so much faster than we thought they were going to change when we started the concept in 2000, because global warming has accelerated to such a degree. For the duration of the winter, it's underneath this wonderful cushion of snow. And the snow is coming later in the season, which means the frost gets in sooner. There's less snow, which means the frost gets into the ground and the plants become more vulnerable. And then the summers have got a lot wetter. How will it be in 100 years' time? A lot of that depends on who's looking after it and whether they decide that they're going to have 10 members of staff or 5 members of staff or 2 members of staff. All that makes a difference in terms of what it's going to be.
Is it a garden?
I think it very definitely is a garden, because it's a managed place, which is managed with skilled people who know where to apply their energy very carefully to get the best results. So even though some of it looks very wild, the right moves made at the right time mean that it can afford to be itself, 90% of itself, and the naughty 10% is kept in check. And that stops it from being the scary place it could be, and therefore it becomes a garden space. And that then makes you able to engage with the natural world in a less fearful state.